Come, spell weavers, reavers, rogues, and men-at-arms, and answer the call of adventure. Pick up your sword, your axe, your spellbook, your bow, your rulebook, and your dice, and join the forces of good in their eternal fight against vile monsters, conspiring min-maxers, horny bards, and blood-soaked murder hobos. Discover the treasure trove of role-playing games here on Rollin Bones. My name is Ryan Howard, and I shall be your guide. Good evening, Boneheads, and welcome back to Rollin Bones with Ryan Howard, where we are making old school young again. I'm your host and king of the Boneheads, Ryan Howard. I am the RNOSR, and this evening we are joined by the esteemed Grayhawk Grognard, Joseph Bloch. I am very happy to talk with him about the history of Grayhawk and several other things. But before we bring him on and get into that, I just want to remind everyone to like, share, and subscribe if you enjoy what we're doing here on Rollin Bones. That's one of the best ways to support me is just to, hit that like button, share this with someone you love or someone you hate, and, subscribe, because you need to know when I'm doing one of these shows or when I put up one of my short form videos. And of course, you can find me at all the social media down here on Twitter and Instagram. I am at Howard_Ryan Gregg. Twitter is where you can find all of my RPG threads that I do every day, Monday through Saturday. People really seem to enjoy those. In fact, some people have found the show through those. So if you're joining me off the back of one of my threads, welcome. This is Rollin Bones. This is what I do every Tuesday night. And of course, you can watch us on YouTube and on Twitch. We are also trying to get Rumble going. Rumble's mostly for politics. There's not a lot of role playing over on Rumble. So, what can we do? And one last piece of my own shilling before we bring on Joe here. I do want to remind everyone that I have, that is not the right view. There we go. You want the T-shirts big and me small. That's the way to do it. But I am on TeePublic. You can get your Rollin Bones T-shirts over on TeePublic. I am going to go ahead and share this with everyone in the comments who wants to buy a T-shirt from TeePublic. One of my friends actually sent me a picture of them in their brand spanking new Bonehead T-shirt. It looked really nice. So those of you who are interested in wearing one of my 3 designs here, those are available for you on TeePublic at the link in chat. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and bring on our guest tonight. As I said, tonight we are talking to Joseph Bloch. He is the Greyhawk Grognard. He is one of the foremost experts on all things Greyhawk. He has a great YouTube channel, which you can find right about here, Greyhawk Grognard. And so, Joe, welcome. Welcome to Rollin Bones.
Well, hello.
Hey,
how you doing? Thanks for having me. This is awesome.
Oh, no problem at all. It's great to talk to you. Cool. So, this was, if anyone watched last week, you know I was not, I did not have a show prepared for this week. So Joe was actually very, very gracious in agreeing to do the show last minute. Especially considering what you went through this weekend, but we won't dwell on that.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm always happy to be anybody's plan B.
Now you were plan A. I did not have anyone else planned on the show. You were my first call. So,
well, I'm glad you called.
And Brian James in chat says he loves the map curtains. So
yes, I get a lot of comments on the map curtains. I actually got them done at a online site, youcustomizeit.com. They'll basically put, it's one of those places you upload a file and they'll print it on whatever you want. So you can't. It's not like they're for sale anywhere. You have to go out and do it yourself because copyright.
Mm-hmm. Now, This is not one of the normal questions that I ask first timers on Rollin Bones, but I do see the tree over your shoulder. So I do have to ask, what is the name of your demon familiar?
That would be Eclipse.
Gotcha.
Viewers on my channel have seen him more than once. Don't know if he's going to make it. Oh no, he's all sacked out over there. So
yeah, I've got Ronan and Avery here in the house, but I closed the door because Ronan will jump on my keyboard and inevitably destroy the stream. Cool, but the way that we usually begin Rollin Bones is I've got a couple questions everyone gets asked their first time. So let's begin at the beginning. Joe, how did you get into role-playing games?
I got into role-playing games from war games. Back in the mid 70s, I was playing like Avalon Hill and SPI war games, hexes and counters and stuff. Mm-hmm. And I was doing that for a couple of years. And in the mid 70s, that's when D&D was really taking off in the gaming community. And I kept hearing about it. And I finally got a copy of the white box, the little brown books. Mm-hmm. And I taught myself how to play tactics too. I couldn't figure this out for the life of me. So I'm 10 years old, 11 years old. I couldn't figure this out. Mm. And so I got a copy of Holmes Basic, which is the blue box with the red dragon on it.
Yep.
Which is designed to be learned. And that was it. That was my entry drug. From war games to Holmes, and then the rest is history.
Gotcha. So you had like the direct pipeline, the same pipeline that the earliest D&D players had.
Yeah, I didn't get into miniatures until I was in college, but yeah, the chits and maps war games that was and still is. You can see behind me here. I've got a few war games up there, so it's still a love.
Gotcha. Now, I know this can be very difficult for a lot of people who dedicate significant amount of time to publishing books, doing, YouTube videos on the subject, but we do these things because we love the game. We love the game because of our fond memories of playing the game. So if you had to pick a fondest RPG memory, what would that be?
Fondest RPG memory. Okay. It was actually not even a D&D game. This was a game of Chaosium did a Ringworld RPG.
Gotcha.
Based on Larry Niven's novels. And we played a game of that in college. And we never actually made it to the Ringworld. It was all just set in known space, and there were Kazinti and there were puppeteers, and one guy was playing an uplifted dolphin. And it was just this spectacular game that was completely oblique from the point of the game. It would be like playing Call of Cthulhu and you never meet Cthulhu because you never go to the Ringworld and you're playing Ringworld. But right. It was so much fun. And we were on a planet called We Made It, which is also in the books. And it was just everybody was so into the known space books at the time. And we were all just it was because of that it all just clicked so great.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned never running into Cthulhu in Call of Cthulhu. You never encounter like the big things from the world you're playing in when you play in one of those like shared world. You're never going to run against Darth Vader in a Star Wars game, and if you do, you better run. Because this is the most powerful thing in your world. This is the reason why this world exists. Essentially, you guys aren't gonna like. What are you going to do? Kill Cthulhu? Kill Darth Vader? You get to rule Ringworld? Like, what?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's what I think made it so fun. It was because it was adjacent to the point of the game.
Yeah.
But you could still use the game to play that. Mm-hmm. So that's why I think that's why it stuck with me.
Gotcha. Now, there is one more question that everyone gets asked on Rollin Bones, but we're going to save that for the very end.
Okay.
And instead, we are going to pivot and talk about your area of expertise, the thing that you are most known for, and that is your knowledge of the world of Grayhawk. So, again, to take it back to the beginning, what was your first experience with the world of Grayhawk?
my first experience with the World of Greyhawk was actually before Greyhawk was published.
Okay.
Because in the Dungeon Master's Guide, there are the artifacts and relics that are in the DMG, and a lot of them are explicitly linked to the World of Greyhawk. So you'd have like the machine of Lum the Mad, that kind of thing. And I was picking up on little bits and pieces of this, because I was pouring through the DM's guide all the time. And so every homebrew campaign I did, I would have a barony of Lum, and I would have the Plains of the Paynins, and I would have the Pale, because they're mentioned specifically in these entries. So I was kind of like getting as much Greyhawk as I could before it was even published. And then as soon as the folio came out, I gravitated to that. I still did a lot of homebrew campaigns, but I kept coming back to Greyhawk. And I think the one thing that impresses me, and still impresses me to this day, about that folio is the amount of stuff that Gygax is able to imply and inspire in so few words. It's almost Hemingway-esque, what the way he's able to craft the wording so that you get the raw bones of the information that you need, but it also gives you just little bits and pieces here and there that lets your imagination just go wild. And it's that room for development that I think really is what made the early Greyhawk campaign so attractive to so many DMs, because it wasn't the only option out there. There were other fantasy campaigns that you could use with D&D or AD&D. There was the Judges Guild campaign. There was Harn. Iron Crown Enterprises had their stuff. So there was stuff out there you could use. But there was something about Greyhawk. It gave you enough to get going, but it didn't deluge you with detail.
Yep. And it's funny you should mention those, because I'll go ahead and drop this hint right now. We'll be talking about one of those other alternate campaign settings later this month when Levi Combs comes on for the history of Arduin. But for now, back in the realm of Greyhawk, I actually want to answer something from chat here. Rex Teal says you were picking up on the implied setting when you were reading D&D.
Well, I use the phrase implied setting a little differently than that, because to me, the implied setting derives from the actual rules, the mechanics of the rules. So, for example, it is implied if you're playing AD&D, it is implied that there are druidic organizations that have 13 levels, and at the very top, there's only a few members in there. It is implied that there are thieves' guilds. It is implied that there are mechanisms for training magic users. To me, that's what when I say the word implied setting, those are the kinds of things I mean, because they're derived from the mechanics of the rules themselves. Yeah. The stuff that's in the artifacts and relics in the DM's guide, I don't say that. I don't see that as implied, because that's explicit. That is explicit setting material. Right. They just hadn't published the setting yet. So it was implicit because it came from Gygax's, obviously, but it wasn't, there wasn't any framework or context to plug it into.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's something that's kind of interesting about D&D as a whole. And something that I think a lot of people miss, especially from my generation. You look at the spell list and you see Melf's Acid Arrow. I know very few people who ask, who is Melf? But they use that spell. And again, using that spell, calling it Melf's Acid Arrow implies there is a person named Melf who used that spell at one point. So, but like you said, that's, yeah.
Like all the Tensor's Hand spells, Mordenkainen's this and that. Yeah. And if you look at those spells, it's funny. It's because the spells that are in the player's handbook and Unearthed Arcana, they give you some indication of the personality of the wizards who develop those spells, especially if you then look into the Greyhawk Adventures hardcover, which has a zillion spells all based on the different wizards. But it's funny because if you look at them, it really tells you something about that wizard. So, for example, the spells by Tensor with the hands and everything. it tells you that he's, not to use a pun, but he's very hands-on, because you've also got Tensor's transformation, which turns you into a fighter. So this is a wizard who actually loves to mix it up in melee, and we get that confirmed later on in another product called the Rogues Gallery, where it gives you little blurbs about some of the famous PCs that were in the early campaigns. But it's funny, if you systematically look through all of Rary's spells, or all of Tensor's spells, and all of Mordenkainen's spells, they really do give you kind of insights into their characters, which I find absolutely fascinating. And to me, it's an indicator that what we're seeing really is a glimpse into the earliest part of the game, when they were actually still developing these spells as players for their characters.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's interesting to look at Grayhawk as a whole, because like I was telling you before we jumped on, I started playing D&D with 5e, and by 5e, Grayhawk essentially doesn't exist anymore within the canon as it is of Dungeons and Dragons. Neither does my preferred setting of Dark Sun. It also pretty much doesn't exist. But it's interesting that Grayhawk, of all settings, passed kind of out of canon the way it did, because Grayhawk is to Gygax as Blackmore is to Arneson. It's like, this was Gary's setting when Gary ran games, even before D&D was called D&D. It was in and around Grayhawk and the features and dungeons that surrounded the city of Grayhawk.
Well, it's interesting to remember that way back when, back in the early 70s, like you say, before it was called D&D, there were a number, in a given group of players, this person would have their big dungeon, and this person would have their big dungeon, and this person would have their big dungeon. And there wasn't that great segregation between, this is my campaign and these are your characters in my campaign. You would just take your character and, tonight we're going to be over here, and the same character 2 nights later is going to be over here in this other dungeon on this other world. They were very looser about that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
They didn't really mind that much when characters would flip between, you're in my campaign, now you're in my campaign, then you're in my campaign. Later on, that became much more, kind of locked down.
Yeah.
But in the early Wild days, and you get a lot of this if you read some of the earliest fanzines out there, like Alarums and Excursions. It's really fascinating to get that glimpse of just what the game was like and how different it was than the game we play today. Even those of us who play first edition or basic, we play differently than they played in the 70s.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting, kind of the looseness in which players would essentially jump from world to world. I think that says a lot about kind of the fantasy that a lot of these people were consuming, because, like, at this point, you're still dealing directly with people who were influenced by Appendix N. So Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser travel pretty freely between Lankhmar and the real world, because Fritz Leiber was having to reconcile 2 different sets of stories that he wrote with each other. So you have kind of this inherent plane hopping, kind of like tossed salad approach to fantasy, where one week we're going to be delving through this very fantasy focused dungeon, and the next week we're going to stumble upon a crashed UFO somewhere out in the jungle. That's just the way that the game was played at that point.
Exactly. And you see that, some of the other fantasy out there, Roger Zelazny with the Amber books, and Elric, that sort of thing. Yeah. They would. You're right. They would just, they were very loosey goosey when it came to the setting, and I think that did translate over into a lot of the way the game was played.
Yep. So, as far as what kind of drew you to Grayhawk, and what really kind of keeps you in Grayhawk, as far as it being a favorite setting of yours, what is it specifically about Grayhawk that really speaks to you as a gamer?
Well, for me, I mean, I'm not going to lie. There's obviously a nostalgia component to it for me. You know, this is the setting I've been using literally since it was published in 1980. So, you know, I'm not going to lie. That's going to be a part of it. But it goes back to what I said earlier about it being not so much lore heavy, at least in the early days, and much more inspirational. You would get a line or two in a paragraph about a country, and that would be enough to just kind of set your creative juices going and take off on stuff. Obviously over the years, as more stuff's been published, and they came out with box sets and more box sets and stuff like that, it's a lot of the cracks have been filled in. But even today, there is vast amounts of area of the World of Greyhawk campaign that has never been described in any detail. So even now there is enormous opportunities for DMs to just make it their own. And that's something that you don't really get in another setting like Forgotten Realms. That's the quintessential. We have covered every freaking detail. And, there's like 9,000 books, novels, and there's, a zillion modules. Modules, by the way, for the youngins among you, that's what we used to call adventures. Yeah. Adventures were modules back in the day. So just so I don't want to lose anybody.
I use the term module all the time on the show. So we're good.
I do, and sometimes I'll just use it, and I'll get a blank stare from somebody. It's like, "What the heck are you talking about?" It's like, "Yeah, it's an adventure." But something I've forgotten else is just too much detail, and plus you got endless articles in Dragon Magazine and all, it just ends up really weighing down the DM. And if I tried to DM Forgotten Realms, I couldn't do it. I would be paralyzed with fear that I would be violating canon somewhere.
Yeah.
Whereas Greyhawk is light enough that you can't, there are places that's not even a risk. Like the entire, almost all of K-Land. Here. That's pretty well, almost completely not developed in terms of being covered by a guidebook or a module or anything like that. So there's lots and lots of opportunity in Greyhawk, even 43 years later, and that's what I love about it, is that you can still make it your own. And that doesn't even mention the fact that we're only seeing a small part of the world in the Flyness. There is an entire rest of the continent of Orc that remains largely unexplored. There are some exceptions, and we can get into that if you want to. And I'm slowly working my way on my blog, trying to map out and detail those areas, like the rest of the Backloonish lands in the northwest. And then on the far side of the Sea of Dust, there's a place called Zahindia, which is kind of a Hindu-esque kind of setting, and I've got maps and a guidebook and monsters and spells and classes and stuff for it on my blog. But but there's vast opportunities to if you want to be creative, you can still be creative within the boundaries of Greyhawk.
Yeah, and it seems to me very much that Greyhawk was designed and remained truly a setting. It was, like you said, here's enough details to kind of get you started, to know essentially what's going on or what there is to do, or who previously was a power player within Greyhawk, but the rest of it is open for you, the GM, and you, the players, to fill out. Whereas Forgotten Realms very quickly became not just a player setting or a player-driven setting, but a setting that like novels were set in. So exactly. in Greyhawk, you don't have to worry about, well, if this is so important, where's Dritz Duerden? Because there's not like a Dritz equivalent in Greyhawk, whereas Forgotten Realms has been so thoroughly mapped out that you basically pick a time period and the GM goes, all right, here is your textbook on what's going on in the world.
And it's funny you should mention time periods, because in Greyhawk, they famously advanced the timeline. And a lot of fans, even to this day, don't like the idea that they advance the timeline. They kind of want it to be like Harn, where everything is frozen in time on a specific date, and just everything that happens after that happens because the players and the GM want it to happen. But they did, they had the Greyhawk Wars, and then they had the From the Ashes, and then they had the Adventure Begins. So they kind of. But even with all that, it only went forward 25 years. It started in CY 576, and the last published book that I'm aware of was CY 591. So even all that stuff only took 25 years of in-game time. Whereas, like you mentioned with the Realms, it's gone like centuries.
Yeah.
And there's been upheavals to the maps and stuff. It's a different scale in that respect.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's sorry. Let me change course here. I had a point, but then I lost it, so I'm just going to change course. When it comes to a lot of these settings, generally, people who are into certain D&D settings, they have in their mind an era where like this was the peak. This is where all the best material, or a lot of the best material from the setting comes from. So if you had to pick kind of a peak period for Greyhawk, where this is where all the best work was done with the Greyhawk setting, where would that be?
Well, that would be the folio / gold box era. Gotcha. The first stuff that was published in game time, it was supposedly published in CY 576, and then the setting kind of took place in 577, 578. That's when Gygax wrote a series of Dragon Magazine articles saying, these are the events in the world of Greyhawk. So they had wars over here, and this army's moving here, and this happened in this place. And that's when all of the classic modules are set. So, gotcha. Village of Hamlet, the Giants, the Drow, and the Slavers, all that kind of stuff place in that one section that immediately after the gold box is supposedly published. And that, I think, is the best era to run a Greyhawk game in. There are advantages to running it in other eras if you want to run a particular kind of game. Right. But overall, I would go with that earliest 576 era myself.
Gotcha. So, in my head, I'm drawing parallels to Dark Sun, which is my favorite D&D setting, where kind of the best era to run Dark Sun in, because you have the most material to work with, is really like 1991 to 1993. You have the original run of Dark Sun modules and box sets where there's enough context for players to have something to really sink their teeth into, but you don't get into some of the craziness that happens kind of after the conclusion of the Prism Pentad books. So
it's funny that because in Greyhawk, it's actually the opposite, because they have more material for the From the Ashes era, which is 585. That's when you get things like the Marklands and I Use the Evil. You have these source books for big, huge regions of the Flamess that detail things. But to my mind, it is precisely that level of detail that I kind of pull away from. I would rather have less detail and more of an evocative framework than to have that level of detail, which is not to say it's a bad thing. It might, you could easily make an argument that having a little more detail is a good thing. But it's funny that you should mention that, because you're judging it on, I have more stuff to work with. And I'm going the opposite. I'm saying, well, I don't want that much stuff to work with. So I just thought it was an interesting parallel.
Yeah. And it really does kind of get down to, I guess, like how people like to play the game. And it sounds like with Greyhawk, a lot of the best material is, again, here's a small amount of detail, and now you guys are going to go out and kind of make the difference in this world, because you're the player characters, you're the important ones. So your choices are going to shape kind of how the world goes forward from here, instead of, well, you have this going on over here and this going on over here. And, in the grand scheme of things, what you guys are doing could be important, but there's also all this other stuff going on.
Well, it's interesting too because a lot of, especially in that early era, a lot of stuff about Greyhawk is show rather than tell. Because we didn't have, after they published the box set or the folio, we didn't have source books.
Right.
All we had were adventure modules. And that's how they kind of grew the settings, little chunk by little chunk by little chunk. So you have something like White Plume Mountain or Hidden Shrine of Tamoakan, which adds details to the setting, or Ghost Tower of Inverness is a great example. It adds details to the setting from like the introductory material and the what's in the dungeon and stuff, but it's added specifically because it's relevant to that adventure. It's not like, oh, we want to do a source book on the County of Ernst. It's just we need to know these couple of details about the County of Ernst to give you some information about the dungeon you're going to. And I like that approach of showing rather than telling. It's not just a big info dump. It's you get targeted stuff specifically relevant to an adventure. Yeah. And I love that way of approaching it.
Yeah. And that's a very good, that's a very utilitarian way to approach, because it's more likely that contextually relevant information is going to stand out rather than here's my essay on the history of this region. It's going to be more, okay, this is important to this adventure, so I need to know it, rather than, oh my God, there's 50 centuries of history here that I have to go through.
Right.
So I do think that's a very smart way to go about kind of filling out a setting, is just like, these are the details that you need right now.
And it's funny because when they first published Forgotten Realms, they promised that one of the kingdoms they would never detail. Right? That was they even said in the gray box, this is the place that you can turn into your own. I think it was Sembia if I'm recalling correctly. And sure enough, in a couple of years, boom, here's a Sembia source book, and they just got to stomp all over everything. So they they did that bait and switch on the fans. But the DMs want that. DMs, at least the DMs that I'm, the kind of DMs that I'm familiar with want that freedom to create rather than just running a published module. And I think that's one of the bigger differences you see in modern 5e gamers compared to OSR type gamers, is that the 5e gamers are willing to, are more likely, I should say, to run the published stuff and these big adventure paths that are going to take them a year to or whatever to finish, rather than sitting down and homebrewing or, heaven forbid, improving an adventure.
Right. Yeah, and I say this as someone who's coming, like who comes out of the 5e crowd originally. There's almost zero reliance on random tables or exploration leading to essentially an emergent adventure. It's all, what do you have planned for us? Where is this going? Where do we hop on the conveyor belt here to take us to the...
Because sandboxes have gone out of style.
Right.
And that really is the epitome of old school play. Whether or not it doesn't matter what edition you're playing. You can do a sandbox with 5e. I've done it. But people don't like to play that way now. They want a story that is already, at least the broad guide rails of which are known already to the GM, and they want to see how the story goes. I'm much more used to a sandbox environment, which, as you just said, the story is emergent from the actions of the players.
Right.
It's not me saying, oh, the story of our campaign is going to be you're going to rescue Prince Thrommel from the Temple of Elemental Evil. It's you're exploring the temple because it's there, and you just happen to run across Prince Thrommel. And it's a very different way of approaching a game, and it's not mechanically driven. It's a mindset.
Right. And this is where kind of I pick up the banner of the sandbox game and try to take it to people like myself who got burned out on 5th edition and say, look, the reason DM burnout is a thing is because you think you have to be a fantasy author.
Right.
You don't. All you have to do is give kind of a big enough space for your players to go get themselves into trouble. And that's where you're going to get your narrative from, is what trouble do your players inevitably find themselves in? Because your players, they're not going to be able to help themselves.
And I don't want to come across like I'm bashing 5th edition, because I like 5th edition. I've played it. I've DM'd it. I think it works best as a short-term game. Like, I'll play it at a convention or something like that. I don't think it scales up to a long-term campaign very well. And it's also, people got to remember, the idea of we're going to play a defined story didn't start with 5th edition or even 4th. It started with 1st, Dragonlance.
Yeah,
it started with Dragonlance, which was a AD&D thing, and I don't want people shouldn't automatically equate, well, everything in AD&D was a sandbox. Not by a long shot,
right?
It just happens to be. It was so wildly successful, that was the model that everybody took from then on, because they all wanted to be on the New York Times bestseller list with novels, because they made a lot more money than adventure modules.
Right. Now that kind of brings me to my next question about Grayhawk. Once Dragonlance comes out, you see a definite shift in the way that TSR at the time publishes material. It's a lot more focused on storylines. It's more, how do we replicate Dragonlance? How do we, and this is where Forgotten Realms kind of shifts into what Forgotten Realms has become. This is where R.A. Salvatore releases his novels. Do you think that Grayhawk ended up being kind of a victim of that shift in mindset?
I don't think it was that. I think that happened concurrently with Grayhawk being shunted aside. But it wasn't because of the shift in tone. Remember, that happened at exactly the same time that Gary Gygax was forced out of TSR.
Right.
And it was a very acrimonious parting. There were lawsuits. Lorraine Williams was, by all accounts, really out to just make it personal and wanted to get rid of Grayhawk just to hurt Gary Gygax. And that's when they started casting him out for a new setting. And that was Forgotten Realms. And because over the years in Dragon Magazine, Ed Greenwood had been, published, sending them all these articles with this incredible detail. And somebody asked him, are you just making this up as you do it, or do you have all this? He's like, I have all in the boxes over here. So, they bought it from him for the price of like a new computer. And, I think the downgrading of Grayhawk was much more a factor of, we want to make a clean break from Gary Gygax, TSR did, than it was in a style of play. I think if it hadn't been as personal as it was, we would have seen that style applied to Grayhawk. I think we would have seen, those kinds of adventure paths specifically designed, the big grand story arcs and things. I think we would have seen that in Grayhawk anyway, because the books make all the money. The novels make all the money. And, especially by that time, they were the biggest fantasy publisher in the world. And they dominated the New York Times bestseller lists because they had all of these Dragonlance and Forgotten Realms and those kinds of novels.
Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, that does make sense. And I figured that Gary leaving or being forced out in the way that he was forced out might have had something to do with it as well. But the interesting thing is, Grayhawk does continue past even Gary's exit. So I guess that leads into my next question. What are your thoughts on kind of the post Gygax Grayhawk that comes out in 2nd edition and then even into 3rd edition? What are your thoughts on the Grayhawk stuff that comes once that split occurs?
Well, that's where, I was talking about the From the Ashes era, that 585 era. that's that. That is them trying to take the Greyhawk campaign into a different direction.
Yeah.
That's when they have all the wars and things are, the kingdoms are knocked down and things like that. They want to turn it into a much darker, grittier kind of setting. And I think that was another attempt to change the setting to make it less Gygaxian deliberately. That said, there's a lot of good material that came out during that. It at the time, I didn't think too highly of it, but over the years, it's really grown on me. The From the Ashes stuff, like I said, I Use the Evil, Marklands, things like that. I think they kind of got repetitive when Vecna was in every other module for a while. It was like, can't we get another villain, please? I'm begging. It was either Vecna or Tharsden every time. Let's do something different, guys. But some really good stuff came out of there, out of that era. But like I say, it does feel different. And I think it feels different because it doesn't have that Gygaxian flair. Like I alluded to at the beginning, where he can just in 2 sentences he can just give you such inspiration and you just go off on your own. This was much more of a I don't want to say workmanlike because that comes across as an insult, but it's much more what we might today call standard.
Yeah.
Rather than, high Gygaxian.
Yeah, and you hit on an interesting point there that I think a lot of people are starting to understand as they're re-examining Gygax. For the longest time, it seemed like the perception of Gygax was that his work was very kind of scattered and there was a lot of non sequiturs in his writing. But I think what a lot of people are starting to come around on is Gygax made these connections in his head and he expected you to make these connections as well. His work is very grounded in historical reference and reference to weird fantasy and sword and sorcery fantasy. So if you understand history, you understand military history in particular, and you are somewhat versed in what weird fantasy or sword and sorcery fantasy is like, you begin to put these pieces together and you can see ultimately what Gygax was hinting at.
Right. And I think you made a very good point just then, is that it makes sense to him.
Yes.
And if you read his work very carefully, you can put together those connections. Once you immerse yourself enough in both Gygax's work and the works of authors he was reading, the whole Appendix N thing. Yep. Once you have that, your own connections will start to spark like that, and you'll be able to follow along.
And I would also argue that Gygax expected you to read and reread and kind of dwell on the words that he wrote and really study them more so than just read once and understand. He wasn't writing instruction manuals necessarily. He was writing he almost wrote in like the way that historians write, like the way that Josephus wrote his history of first century Israel. That's kind of the way that Gygax wrote, and he expected people to take more of a scholarly approach to understanding the rules and the settings of Dungeons and Dragons.
Well, you see this especially in there's a couple of adventures that he wrote where you need to read every single line in order to really figure out what's going on. Vault of the Drow is a perfect example. In fact, the people who wrote the sequel to Vault of the Drow, Queen of the Demon Web Pits, had obviously not done that. Because their sequel had nothing to do with the plot that was developed in the first 6 adventures in the series. Because if you read it carefully, you'll know that Eclavdra and the Drow who are behind the giant raids are rebels who have left Lolth, the Spider Queen, and are worshiping this elder elemental god, which is all tentacles and things. And yet, when you get to the final adventure, You're going after Lolth, and there's no mention of the Elder Elemental God. Why? I don't know. Just because. And in fact, that annoyed me so much, I actually wrote my own, which I called Web of Souls, which is available for free on my blog, grayhawkgrognard.com. But it's interesting because there's a lot of details about not only about just the plot, that is just they're hidden little bits and places all throughout the Giants and the Drow series. But he does the same thing in a lot of his in something like the Forgotten Temple of Tharizdun.
Yep.
Where there's a lot of detail, but it's not just all laid out in a big introduction. You have to carefully pick around and see, why does this apparition look like a bunch of snakehead tentacle things? Oh, that's why, because it's explained over here. But you really do need to read through them very, very carefully to get all those connections, or else you won't get everything you can out of them. Temple of Elemental Evil is much the same way, although that suffers because it had two authors. Gygax just kind of handed over a whole sheaf of notes to Frank Metzer, and some things got lost in that translation. But it's still much the same thing, and he'll expect that what porphyry looks like. It's kind of stone, and if you don't know that porphyry is a particular color and carnelian is another color, and then when you see a checkerboard of porphyry and carnelian in a room, those colors are significant because you've already seen them in Vault of the Drow. It's just you really have to know what it is you're reading in order to get the most out of it.
Scott, I am not going to correct my guest here. Come on now.
What did I do? What did I do wrong?
He does. I think Scott takes issue with you saying Drow instead of Drow.
It's Drow, and I don't care, and I'm not changed.
See, I'm from the South, so I say Drow, but
actually, according to the pronunciation guide that they published in Dragon Magazine, either is correct. So
fair enough. It's all right. I get on people who call Ra's al Ghul Ra's al Ghul. So
yeah. Yes. No, I get those comments every time I talk about the Drow.
I also get mad at people who call him or call the family the Harkonnen family instead of Harkonnen.
Harkonnen, yes. Although for the longest time, because I'd only read it, I didn't know how to pronounce Atreides. Until I realized that in one of Gurney Halleck's songs, he actually rhymes it with the word ladies. That's the only reason I was able to figure out how to pronounce that dumb name. And even now, people who are experts in the books call it Atreides. It's just that. Anyway.
Now, legacy game mastering, you mean you don't like it when people say Drizzt? That's one of those where I'm like, look, I understand that it's hard to pronounce, but where are you getting that extra I sound?
Yeah, exactly.
But no, getting back into the world of Greyhawk here, one of kind of the last gasps of Greyhawk actually comes far later than I thought it did, because I was not gaming at this time. But this is Living Greyhawk, which comes about in 2000 and carries all the way through to 2008. Now, we had an earlier comment about Living Greyhawk from Kevin King, in which he says that it should be considered bloat if you consider it canon at all. So I guess, what are your thoughts on this kind of late stage, attempt to keep Greyhawk alive with Living Greyhawk?
I'm going to get into a lot of trouble with this, and I keep promising that I'm going to do a whole video about Living Greyhawk on my channel and why I don't like it. I'm not a fan of Living Greyhawk. I was I didn't actively participate in it. I think the comment was one of the reasons I don't like it, is because it was bloat. They they took the Forgotten Realms approach to Greyhawk with the Living Greyhawk Gazetteer, where everything has to have multiple page histories and all this stuff that nobody's ever heard of before. They tend to not pay close enough attention, in my opinion, to canon that had been previously published, especially when you get into the adventures, because they had such a constant need to have adventures. They couldn't really apply the level of quality control on those adventures that you could get at, in regular publishing.
Yeah.
And I think because you had that real varying in terms of quality, I think that really hurt it, at least to me. And I know a lot of people love it. A lot of people had, that's their best experiences. They have wonderful memories of it. And I get it. I understand. I don't think it feels like Greyhawk. And it feels like 1,000 people got together and all mushed together their homebrew campaign Greyhawks.
Right.
And much as I love other Greyhawk fans, I don't need to hear about what happened in your campaign where your characters killed Ayus or whatever. Yeah. I get the feeling when I read Living Greyhawk material, with notable exceptions. There's some really fantastic Living Greyhawk adventures out there, but they are the minority. And I just get the feeling that they were so pressed. They had to have Living Greyhawk material for events that they were just throwing stuff out there without really vetting it. And I think it showed.
Yeah. And it seems to me, again, just from the conversation that we've had, it seems to me like kind of the appeal of Greyhawk is almost a lost history. Like there is a history here, but it's not overly explored. It's not overly explained, and it's very contextual. It's very much in how you are interacting with these things. That's where you get some of this history. It's a lot of having to uncover it. Whereas with Living Greyhawk and, with Forgotten Realms and even with Dark Sun to an extent, it's a lot of, here's the history. Here's your history book. Here's your tome of all that is known about this world. And instead of leaving it up to imagination or leaving it up to discovery, we're going to explain this to you.
Right. And I have a perfect example of this. I use the evil demigod who rules, part of the Flyness. His mother is Igwilv, the Witch Queen. And she features in one of the modules, The Lost Caverns of Sajkanth. And obviously Ayuz is, there's information about him in the gold box and in some of the modules here or there, but there's no real comprehensive thing. So what I did was I set out to kind of compare the timelines between the two. And you have to actually go to like 3 or 4 different sources. And once you do that, you realize that Ayuz was expanding his empire while his mother was alive. But as soon as she went away, his advances stop. So it's not said anywhere, but he was relying on her to help him expand his realm. Because the expansion stops as soon as she disappears. But it is completely inferred. You will not find that spelled out anywhere. And I thought that was absolutely fascinating. And I can't help but wonder what other hidden things like that are still out there in those older modules that are just waiting to be found.
Absolutely. I think Rex Teal here makes a good point in chat. If everything's already been done, discovered, and explored, what's the point of adventuring?
Yeah, exactly. Which takes us back to the showing rather than telling approach that they had in the early days. It was these were the first. A lot of it also had to do with the fact that they were trailblazing at the time. there weren't, we didn't have 40 years of examples of dungeons. But that's actually, I'm gonna go off on a tangent here. That's actually a really good point about examples and the original Greyhawk campaign, because obviously the original Greyhawk campaign was focused almost exclusively on the dungeons beneath Castle Greyhawk. And if you read the rules in the player's handbook and the DM's guide, and you look at some of the mechanical aspects of things, like potion of treasure finding, or gnomes and dwarves being able to tell the direction and how deep they are underground by licking the wall or whatever they do. Those are or being able to discover new construction. That's always a great one. Those are rules that only make sense in a mega dungeon.
Right.
They have no applicability outside of a huge mega dungeon complex where new levels are being added and there are sloping passages and elevator rooms. They are useless without that context. But in the earliest days of D&D, what is the one kind of dungeon they never published? A big mega dungeon. Everything were these one-shot tournament modules. So there's this dichotomy. If you're just picking it up at the time in the 70s or the 80s, and you're looking at the player's handbook, which is talking about having a caller and to get your party to the part of the dungeon where you left off, or you set goals. Your goal is to find the next the stairway down to the next level of the dungeon. But the examples they're giving are dungeons that have 1 or 2 levels. It doesn't make any sense. And I think the trajectory of the game would have been a lot different if we had an example of Castle Greyhawk or El Raja Key or Maury Castle, whatever, if we had a big 12-level dungeon like that as an example to guide us in those of us who weren't learning from people who learned from people who learned from Gygax,
right?
Which happened a lot, especially across college campuses in the mid 70s. And again, just go back to Alorums and Excursions, and you'll see what I'm talking about. But if they had published something like that for the vast majority of us who were learning it from the books rather than from other people who knew how to play, I think it would have gone very differently.
Absolutely. Now to make kind of a hard pivot here, just at the very end of our time here this evening, on your YouTube channel, you actually put out what I think is one of the better videos on the subject, because it's very succinct. It's to the point. There's little in the way of editorializing, although there's plenty to editorialize about with this topic. But your video, Goodbye WotC, where you basically just went over a year's worth of here's all the reasons why I'm not buying any more WotC products. So, see you guys. I have to applaud you for that. I really think it was a good quality video that you made there.
Well, thank you. And I got to say, I have no idea why it went viral. It has gotten literally thousands of times more hits than some of my other videos. It's gotten 45,000 views, which for me is just like unbelievable. And it's got like 1,000 comments. And I don't know why. I'm not saying anything that other people haven't said, but I think it's because I don't normally do that on my channel. Right. I normally keep it to, very pedantic, here we're going to talk about Voluna today in the world of Greyhawk. But I just, the number of times that they can just show their contempt for their customers. And that's the word. I mean, they have demonstrated half a dozen times at least in the last 6 months. We're just an impediment to them getting our money.
Right.
It's like, how dare those peasants keep our money in their wallets? That's all there is. That's all there is to them. I mean, I'm not going to go through all the litany. I mean, I'm sure you've heard.
Oh yeah.
I'm sure your audience knows about all the stuff and taking artist names off of posters and buying their own ethics award and it's just you can't make it up. I mean, and the whole the whole Pinkerton thing was just surreal.
The Pinkerton thing, I got a solid like 3 days of decent jokes out of the Pinkerton situation, because I wrote a like 15-page history paper about the Pinkertons when I was in college. And so I'm just like, I will never have any other chance to make these jokes again. And so I was just like posting pictures of James McParlin saying, WotC's chief of security, my top suspects are the Molly Maguires and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And
I'm literally waiting for them to buy an orphanage and kick the kids out.
Yeah.
At this point. I mean, other than tying a woman to a railroad track, I can't think of anything else that's left for them at this point.
Well, one of the first things I did when I saw that news was I jumped in the Basic Experts Gilded server, and I said, has anyone checked to see if WotC has tied Ginny D to a railroad track?
Oh my God. I wish I thought of that. That's perfect. But my God. And I made a couple memes about it myself. And one of them was, not to be outdone, Game Shop hires the Bow Street Runners to back down people who are letting out Space Marines early. It's just, oh my God, you just can't get it. It's impossible to think that this is a professionally managed company at this point. Yeah. I mean, it's like they're deliberately trying to poison their own well, and I've seen that advance too, that maybe this is deliberate because they want to sell, because Hasbro wants to sell off WotC. So they're doing this on purpose just to lower the price. Who the hell knows? But I honestly think that they are very certain that people who play the game using books are not their audience anymore. And they are firmly convinced they will make a lot more money with an online VTT based game than they will with people buying dead trees. And they in their calculus, I really believe they think they can afford to lose every current customer they have because they're going to make more off of these new customers they're going to get on their VTT. Right. I honestly think that's their mindset at this point.
Mm-hmm. And the thing with Hasbro, and I don't even know if there is any strategy to it, Hasbro is not a very intelligently run company to begin with. They're a company that was extremely successful at manufacturing plastic toys, which people got a lot of enjoyment out of. People love G.I. Joe, people love Transformers, but kids don't buy toys anymore. So this company that has built an empire on physical plastic toys now is essentially kind of without their thing that previously made them money. So yeah, you can sell kind of upscale, higher end toys to the adults who remember playing with G.I. Joes. You can sell them fancier G.I. Joes now, but there's only so much money to be gained from that. A lot of people who played with G.I. Joes just don't even think about wanting to own G.I. Joes anymore. So, they tried the movies. The Transformers movies were somewhat successful for a little bit. G.I. Joe never made it off the ground as a movie property, which is maybe like the dumbest.
It could have been. It could have, if they had just given it a little more love and one more pass in the writing, it would have been really great.
Oh yeah.
But I honestly think the Transformers movies are making something of a comeback because with Bumblebee, they brought the designs back closer to being Gen 1.
Yep.
And that's what I knew Transformers. Those were Transformers when I was in college. I had all the Decepticons and my roommate had all the Autobots. And those are the Transformers I remember.
Yeah. And
they brought them back, and the new trailer for the new movie with the animals, what do you call it? The new one. Where the designs, they have a lot of stuff from the movie, Transformers, the animated movie with Unicron, and they have RC, and they have the Predacons and things. So I think that's going to I think that's breathing a little more life into it because it's making it more approachable to people like me.
Yeah.
Who remember them looking more like they're starting to look now.
Mm-hmm.
But even then, that's not enough to support an entire company.
Yep. Maliki, you make a good point about a G.I. Joe movie. At the very least, Larry Hama should have been like a creative consultant on that movie. But, they just decided to... I don't even know how to describe what they did with those G.I. Joe movies. They're not good.
No, they're not. They had some good moments.
Yeah.
But they're not... I think it's because they're not rewatchable.
Mm.
I watched the first one in the theater and I kind of liked it. The best part for me was they had that homage to the opening credits of the G.I. Joe movie. Remember where they're attacking the Statue of Liberty and all the balloons are coming up and the Cobra guys are coming down in the parachutes. One of the fight scenes in the G.I. Joe movie had all these balloons coming up, and it's like, oh, they're doing an homage to the G.I. Joe movie with Cobra Law. But that, but yeah, it was kind of meh. And everything was Storm Shadow, and I don't care. And
yeah,
I would much rather have seen Zaymot and Tomax.
Agreed. Yeah. But they just it's blunder after blunder. They keep trying to be something else. They keep trying to pivot into something new. And now with, I guess, like the way that the VTT is going and the way they're kind of shifting even Magic to kind of a digital first format, I guess they're trying to be video game developers now.
And didn't they just bump up the price of Magic cards 50% or something? I headline. Mm-hmm. It's like, guys, what is it? It's literally like they're trying to sabotage themselves. And for D&D, for the D&D side, they don't go to cons.
Right.
Is it any wonder they don't know their audience?
Mm-hmm.
Even when they bring them in for that cockamamie Creators Summit, they couldn't get that right.
Right.
I mean, you wouldn't have to do that if you were going to Gen Con and if you were going to Gary Con or Origins or anything. You wouldn't need to bring them in special. You'd be talking to them, all weekend long.
Right.
But I don't know. I can't figure it. But you know what? It's not my problem anymore because I'm not buying any more of their books. Even if they have Grayhawk stuff in them, I'm going to buy them used. I'm not going to buy any more figures. I'm not going to. I'm out of Wizards of the Coast. And I don't care. They could publish a Grayhawk a box set at this point. I'm off the bandwagon. I'm off their bandwagon. Yeah. I will, like I say, I'll buy a used copy for the lore. I have 900 pages of 5th edition Grayhawk stuff on my blog, in the free download section.
Yeah.
And that's if people want it, take it. It's free. I mean, I'm not going to pay them any more money. And that's why I'm systematically removing the OGL from my books.
Mm-hmm.
Not that I'm paying the money to have it in there, but as a statement, you don't need it. It is not required to have that license in there for something that isn't a restatement of their material.
Right. Yeah.
It's one thing if you're doing a retro clone where, you're using their combat system and their races and everything. Then you probably want to use what they did. I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. Mm-hmm. But, now that they have released everything into Creative Commons, there's no earthly reason that I can see to use the license, because the license is actually more restrictive because it's, and I know people vehemently disagree with me on that because, they say that there's something about, you can't be sued if you use the license. Well, that's not true at all. They could just shut you down. You just got a 30-day grace period. So I don't know.
To answer DM Bloodworth in chat here, which, welcome, DM Bloodworth. It's been a while since I've seen you on here. I'm glad you're joining us this evening. The VTT will not be ready until 2025. Otherwise, they will launch it full of bugs. Here's the thing. Just based on the way the video game market works, launching full of bugs is not an issue for way too many companies. There are video games that launch in such like a catastrophic state that you wonder how anyone is even employed in QA at all at any of these companies. But they just, because you can patch games now, that's what they do. They launch the game when they, I guess, need the influx of cash. And then they're just like, well, we'll fix all the problems later with patches. We'll patch it. The patches are free. Just as long as we get this money right now from you people, that's all that matters to us. It doesn't matter if our product looks bad on launch because we'll fix it eventually.
Well, especially because they're going to be using a subscription model.
Yeah.
So from their standpoint, you'll keep paying your $10 a month for the next year. We'll get $120, and then you'll get your the real game. Mm-hmm. I work in IT, and I know firsthand. I'm a project manager. I'm an IT project manager, and I know firsthand how long it takes to develop software, or even to implement software that's already been developed. And they're dreaming. If they only started last year, they're dreaming on getting this out next year.
Yeah, absolutely. Calvaroni, wonder what's coming in 2024 for the 50th anniversary. Radiant Citadel 2, Electric Boogaloo.
Yeah. Well, 2024 is also the 10th anniversary of Castle Mad Archmage, and there will be a special edition for that. I can announce it here first.
That's an anniversary worth celebrating. So now, while we're on the subject of kind of leaving WotC behind, I'm going to go back to a question that Brian James left us earlier. What RPGs do you prefer other than first edition D&D or AD&D?
Right now, that's pretty much all.
Okay.
And in that definition, I include things like Swords and Wizardry Advanced and Labyrinth Lord Advanced and that kind of thing. To me, they're all one big blob, and something that's written for Labyrinth Lord will work just fine with AD&D, and something that's written for Osric will work fine. The mechanical differences in the vast majority of those games that are based either on AD&D or Basic are 99% interchangeable, and I just treat them all as one. I mean, when I was back in the 80s, we would take the combat system from Claw Law and Arms Law, the magic system from Call of Cthulhu, and the character system from the Player's Handbook, and we would still just call it D&D. Mm-hmm. It's just the way it worked. And that's the same attitude I have today. It's all just D&D to me. Mm-hmm. But I don't. Yeah. But in terms of other more outre games, I play Call of Cthulhu sometimes, and I really enjoy it. And but other than that, if I want to experiment with a game nowadays, it's going to be either a board game or a miniatures game, rather than an RPG. Hmm.
Well, yeah, and I mean, RPGs. It's kind of like. I guess it's kind of like cigarettes in a way. The brand you start with is the brand you smoke the rest of your life. So, I think for a lot of people, you can kiss WotC goodbye and still play D&D if you have all your old material. You've held on to it for a long time. You can play the D&D that you know and love without ever having to give them a dime. Now, Legacy Game Mastering just shed out Castles and Crusades here, which is one of my favorites. So.
Yeah, we played Castles and Crusades when it first came out. I went back to AD&D. It's just, part of it is I can actually run AD&D without a book if I need to. So I've got it so internalized. It's just second nature.
Yeah, absolutely. And once you have a game that committed to memory, I mean, at that point, playing another game is just kind of for the novelty of let's see what this game does differently.
Right. And at that point, all you can do is write expansions for it.
Yeah.
So.
Absolutely. And that's as good a point as any to transition. So I just want to show people here before we go home this evening, I do want to point everyone to your blog here, which is grayhawkgrognard.com. I dropped the link in chat already. I will do so again right now. But this is the home base of all things Grayhawk Grognard. So why don't you tell people what all they can find here and where all it will direct them.
All right, up at the top there's a link called Free Resources. That's where you will find a whole bunch of PDFs. There is 900 pages of 5th edition Grayhawk material with classes and new spells and monsters and all kinds of good stuff. There is stuff on expanding the Flyness. So there's the stuff on the back Loonish Basin. There are finishing up those articles that Gygax wrote about the goings on in the Flyness. There's Zahindia. There's a whole bunch of miscellaneous stuff in there. Also on the blog, you'll find a link to BRW Games, which is my publishing company. That's the publisher of Adventures Dark and Deep, which is a series of expansion rule books for 1st edition, as well as a couple of core books if you want to play it on its own. There is also a link to the Grayhawk Grognard YouTube channel, which right now is my most active vehicle for getting my stuff out there. I do a regular Grayhawk video every Thursday. I do a quick adventure hook every Sunday, and I do other videos needed.
Gotcha. Absolutely. Even adventure hooks from the hospital, which is a level of dedication that I have not seen so far. So.
Well, it's funny because on the way to the hospital, I was worrying to my wife, I didn't do my video for Sunday. I got to do my video for Sunday. And I was literally just sitting in the bed, and I'm like, I'm going to do a video. Okay. It's not like I had anything else to do, waiting for the nurses to show up. So yeah, I did. I actually did an adventure hook from the hospital bed. But I really appreciate all the well wishes from folks who watched that. Right now, the good news is I did not have a heart attack, and everything seems fine. We're still doing follow-up tests, but I seem to be okay.
Gotcha. And for those of you out there who are watching who will be at North Texas RPG Convention, you will be there as a vendor as well.
Yes, this is the first time I'm going to North Texas. I will be there as a vendor. I will be that will be the showcase for my new book, Swords of Wuxia, which is a 1st edition Orange-Spine expansion book for OSR games that is kind of like Oriental Adventures, but it's based more on ancient China. So it's got hopping vampires and men and hungry ghosts. It's a mixture of Chinese mythology and wuxia movies, so kung fu movies. It's got a kung fu system that with other games and so forth. It's kind of a redo of a book I did several years ago called Golden Scroll of Justice. This has about a third brand new material, a third completely reworked material because I removed the open game license, and a third of it is about the same as the old book. So it's definitely worth getting. It's premiering at the con. You will be able to get it there, and I will be happy to sign it there. It will be available for sale on Drive-Thru RPG that same weekend. So yay. And while we're talking about it, I just want to point out that my previous book, Swords of Cthulhu, is up for a 3 Castles Award at the con as well. So I'm looking forward to coming in a distant 7th on that. But just being nominated is going to be a lot of fun.
Hmm. And Luau Lu is asking the important questions here. How much cash will I need for that beauty?
This is $30, and it comes with a free PDF copy as well.
Sweet. All right. Well, once again, Joe, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been a great conversation. And we'll have to do this again sometime.
Thanks for having me. I will be happy to come on at short notice whenever you need me.
Absolutely. I feel like there's just so much more to discuss here that we didn't even get into. So at some point,
we got sidetracked on Transformers and G.I. Joe. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely. All right, well, guys, that is going to do it for Rollin Bones this evening. To let you guys know what's coming up the rest of this month, because we've got something special planned for the rest of May. For the first time ever, we are going to have 2 shows in a row, 2 weeks in a row with the same guest. That guest will be Levi Combs of Planet X Games. This is the Planet X Invasion, and the Planet X Invasion Phase 1 will start next week with our discussion of non-fantasy influences on role-playing games. And then we will follow that up the following week, Tuesday the 23rd, by talking about the history of Arduin. So Levi is absolutely psyched about both of those topics. He will be on 2 weeks in a row. He'll be the first guest in Rollin Bones history to do 2 shows 2 weeks in a row. So I'm looking forward to that, and I hope you guys are looking forward to that too. So until next time, whether you rolled a 1 or a 20, I am so glad that you rolled your bones with me, Ryan Howard, and I will see you guys next time.